Tonight, we step into an age where fire was not just warmth, but judgment, where whispers could send neighbours to the stake, and where silence was crafted by the very institution that claimed to guard the light. The witchcraft eras were not only about superstition or fear, they were about power, control, and the careful rewriting of memory. For centuries, the Vatican shaped the narrative, guiding who was branded a servant of the devil and who was elevated as a saint. The difference often had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with authority. Behind monastery walls and deep within sealed archives lie trial records, petitions, and forgotten appeals that could expose how thousands were condemned not for crimes but for convenience. This is not just a story of witches. It is the story of how faith was weaponized, how fear was scripted into law, and how history itself was chained behind locked doors. So, before you believe the story you were taught in school, ask yourself, who benefits from the silence? Like the video, subscribe. Because tonight, we open the doors to the trials they tried to bury, fire. That is the first image that burns into our memory when we think of witchcraft. Flames rising into the night sky, crowds gathered in silence, and a single figure tied to the stake, her screams swallowed by the roar of the fire. But look closer, and you will see more than fire. Behind the smoke, there are ink-stained hands, men writing verdicts on parchment, recording names, sealing fates. Beyond the courtroom, there are heavy doors of stone and wood, bolted shut, leading down into archives where dust rests on shelves no one is allowed to see. The story of the witch hunts was not only written in blood and ash, it was written in silence. And silence, as we will learn, is often the loudest weapon of all. For centuries, the world was taught that witches were enemies of faith, servants of darkness, women and men who sold their souls to the devil. But have you ever wondered who decided this? Who gave the word witch its power? Who turned superstition into death sentences? The answer does not lie only in the village squares where pyres were built. It lies in Rome, in the Vatican, where the most powerful religious institution in Europe shaped the very idea of witchcraft and gave it the authority of divine law. When flames rose in the countryside, it was because words had first been whispered in marble halls. Picture the scene. The year is 1580. Across Europe, famine spreads, disease strikes, and war drains villages of life. People search for an answer. When crops fail, when children die, when storms destroy harvests, fear takes the shape of blame. A neighbour, a healer, a widow. But fear alone does not ignite thousands of fires. Fear must be given permission. Fear must be given rules. It was papal bulls, decrees, and letters signed in the name of the Church that granted local courts the power to hunt. The Vatican's words travelled faster than armies, and in their wake came inquisitors, manuals, and verdicts that turned suspicion into trials and trials into executions. Yet for every record of a trial we can read today, there are many more we cannot. Sealed away in Vatican vaults are bundles of trial transcripts, testimonies, and letters never shown to the public. Why? If the Church believed these trials were just, why not release every page? What is so dangerous about the words of a peasant woman accused of flying at night, or a midwife accused of charms? Could it be that hidden in those transcripts lies something the Church does not want us to know? Maybe confessions, extracted by torture so brutal they shatter the idea of justice. Maybe contradictions between verdicts and doctrine. Or maybe evidence that many were innocent, condemned only because their existence threatened power. History books often reduce the witch hunts to a tragic superstition of the past, a nightmare of ignorance we have outgrown. But step into the firelight again, and you will see it differently. You will see order in the chaos, structure in the fear, and control in the silence. The Vatican was not simply a spectator to these hunts. It was the architect of a system where faith and fear merged into a single weapon, and when the last flame died, the smoke did not rise into nothing. It drifted into the archives, where the stories of the accused remain locked away, waiting for a day when someone dares to ask why they were hidden at all. Before the Vatican ever spoke the word witch, it lived in the whispers of villages. For centuries, long before trials and inquisitors, stories of strange women and wandering men moved through Europe as folklore. A healer with herbs, a wise woman with charms, a neighbour blamed when milk soured or storms struck. These were not yet heretics. They were feared, sometimes respected, and often tolerated. Witchcraft, in this early sense, was not a crime against God, but a superstition born of daily life, a way for people to explain the unexplainable. But then something changed. What was once local rumour became global sin. What was once folklore became heresy. And the question is, who had the power to make that shift? The answer leads us into the councils and writings of the medieval church. In the 10th century, a church document known as the Canon Episcopi declared that night flights and meetings with spirits were illusions. The church itself argued that these were tricks of the mind, not real acts. Yet by the 15th century, the very same ideas were treated as proof of a pact with the devil. How did belief transform so completely? It was not nature that changed, it was policy. With every new decree, with every papal bull, the Vatican rewrote the meaning of witchcraft. By the end of the Middle Ages, to be called a witch was no longer to be accused of superstition. It was to be accused of treason against heaven. Imagine what that did to ordinary people. A midwife who once delivered babies with herbs and prayers now stood accused of conspiring with Satan. A farmer who used charms to protect his cattle could be put on trial for serving the devil. What had once been folklore was rebranded as rebellion against God himself. And the church, by controlling the definition, also controlled the punishment. To question the definition was to question doctrine. To doubt doctrine was to risk your own life. This shift was not random, it served a purpose. As Europe entered centuries of famine, plague, and conflict, the Vatican needed a target that could absorb the fear of millions. By labelling witches as heretics, the Church gained both a spiritual and political weapon. Heresy was the greatest crime of the age, worse than theft or even murder, because it threatened the soul. And when witchcraft became heresy, every accusation carried eternal weight. Trials were no longer about neighbours arguing. They were about saving Christendom from collapse. Or at least, that is what people were told. But not all records tell the same story. In some rural accounts, villagers still saw witches as tricksters or healers. It was the clergy and inquisitors who elevated the accusation into something far darker. By writing and rewriting the rules, the Vatican ensured that the word witch no longer belonged to the people who invented the tales. It belonged to the Church. And with that power, they named not just who was guilty, but what guilt itself meant. To name the witch was to name the enemy. And in doing so, the Vatican turned folklore into fire. In the 10th century, the Canon Episcopi was written, a church text that should have closed the door on centuries of fear. It stated clearly that women who claimed to fly by night with spirits or ride with pagan goddesses were not witches at all, but dreamers, their visions mere illusions planted by the devil to deceive them. The message was not that witches were real, but that belief in witches was a sin of imagination. For a moment in time, the Church's official stance was that there were no dark flights, no covens, no midnight gatherings under the moon. It was a statement of skepticism, a declaration that witchcraft was nothing but lies whispered in the mind. But that certainty did not last. As centuries passed, the Canon Episcopi was not forgotten, but quietly bent. By the 14th and 15th centuries, voices inside the Vatican no longer treated night flights as illusions. They insisted they were real. The idea of witches as deluded dreamers was replaced with witches as physical conspirators meeting with the devil himself. What had once been dismissed as fantasy now became a literal crime, punishable by fire. This shift may seem small, but it reshaped the entire map of European history. A single sentence that once told priests to ignore witch tales became a weapon that told them to hunt. Why the contradiction? Why did the Church abandon its own words? The answer lies in the pressures of the age. Europe was sinking under waves of plague, famine, and war. People needed explanations, and leaders needed culprits. It was far more useful to say witches were real and dangerous than to admit suffering might be beyond control. And once the Church had accepted witches as reality, the battlefield changed. Folklore became evidence, dreams became confessions, fear became policy. The canon episcopi still existed, copied in manuscripts and preserved in archives, yet its meaning was slowly buried under layers of reinterpretation. The very text that dismissed witches became proof of their existence when read through the new lens of demonology. It is a strange irony that the Church, which once called witchcraft an illusion, now demanded absolute belief in it. To doubt the existence of witches in the 15th century was itself dangerous. Denying them meant denying the devil's war against Christendom, and that was heresy. The contradiction reveals something deeper. History is not a straight line. It bends according to the needs of those who write it. In the 10th century, it was convenient to call witches deluded. In the 15th century, it was convenient to call them soldiers of Satan. The words did not change because truth changed. They changed because power required it. And today, if you open the archives of Rome, you can still find the canon episcopi copied in elegant Latin script, a reminder that the Church once denied the very thing it later punished thousands of people for believing. In that contradiction, you can see how history itself was rewritten, how superstition became law, and how a single text was turned upside down to serve the flames. When we imagine the witch hunts, we often see flames, judges, and frightened villagers. But long before a single pyre was built, the power of witchcraft was being shaped in silence, behind stone walls and candlelight, inside the scriptoria of monasteries and the chanceries of bishops. These were the true custodians of memory, the men who decided what was written, what was copied, and what would be forgotten. In a world where almost no one could read or write, the written word was not just a tool of learning, it was a weapon of control. Picture a monk bent over parchment, carefully dipping his quill, copying words about maleficium, the so-called evil workings of witches. Each stroke of ink gave permanence to suspicion. Each manuscript carried the same stories across borders. What a farmer might dismiss as rumour became law when preserved in the vaults of monasteries. And because so few texts survived outside these institutions, what the monks chose to copy became the entire memory of a society. In their silence and repetition, they created a bottleneck through which all knowledge had to pass. The chancery of a bishop worked much the same way. Here scribes wrote records of trials, lists of suspects, and confessions gathered under pressure. When these documents were sealed with a bishop's authority, they gained weight far beyond the village where the accusation began. An isolated quarrel between neighbours transformed into official history, and once recorded, it could be cited again and again, each time expanding the reach of the idea that witches were real and dangerous. It was not only memory, it was evidence recycled through the hands of those who controlled the archives. What makes this so powerful is the absence of alternatives. Imagine a woman accused of poisoning cattle through sorcery. Her story might be told in the village, but only the official version written in church records survived the centuries. Her defense, her protests, her daily life, all of it was erased unless a scribe decided it mattered, and most often it did not. The memory of witchcraft became a memory built by one side only. The accused was silenced twice, first in life, then in history. This monopoly over memory created a strange illusion. By the 15th and 16th centuries, when people looked back at the preserved documents, it seemed undeniable that witches had always been a threat. After all, the records said so. but those records existed because monks and clerks had chosen to repeat them. Stories that might once have been dismissed as drunken tales were preserved with the authority of the church. Over time, the archive itself became proof. People believed not because they saw witches, but because they read about them. Today, hidden deep within Vatican vaults, many of these documents still exist. Shelves of parchment filled with names, charges, and verdicts. They are not only relics of the past, they are reminders that memory can be shaped, narrowed, and controlled. The monasteries and chanceries did not simply preserve history, they created it. And when we speak of witches, we are often repeating the words they chose to leave behind, while the voices of the accused remain forever lost in smoke and silence. The witch hunts did not happen by accident. They were not random bursts of fear or isolated trials in lonely villages. They were built on a system, a machinery that blended theology with law, belief with bureaucracy, and fear with confession. At the heart of this machinery was demonology, the study of demons and their supposed work in the world. But demonology was never just theory. It was fused into confession, penance, and jurisdiction until the hunt for witches became a logical outcome of the church's own design. Confession was the first gear. In a world where every soul was watched by God and judged by priests, confession was not just a ritual, it was surveillance of the human heart. People were expected to speak their sins to a confessor, who would then assign penance. This worked for ordinary faults, but when witchcraft entered the vocabulary of sin, confession became a trap. The questions asked were no longer about anger or envy. They became questions about the devil. Did you speak to him? Did you sign his book? Did you fly at night? A frightened villager under pressure could be led to admit to things they had never imagined, because silence was itself treated as guilt. The machinery turned doubt into evidence. Penance was the second gear. Once a confession was made, the priest had to prescribe punishment. For ordinary sins, it might be fasting or prayer, but for witchcraft, penance quickly escalated. Some were told to publicly repent, others faced imprisonment, and for many, penance meant fire. The logic was simple and cruel. If the devil's grip was eternal, only death could purify the soul. Thus, spiritual healing became physical destruction, and the church claimed it was an act of mercy to save a person by killing them. Jurisdiction was the third gear. The question of who had the right to judge witches gave the Vatican enormous power. Bishops claimed authority, inquisitors were dispatched, and papal bulls granted permission for hunts to spread. The church's courts blurred with secular courts, creating a web where no accused person could escape. Even if one judge doubted the charges, another would press forward, armed with decrees that made witchcraft a crime against both God and society. The machinery allowed no space for innocence. Once accused, the gears were already moving. Demonology gave this machinery its fuel. Manuals written by scholars and priests described in detail how witches were said to operate, what signs to look for, and how the devil corrupted human beings. These texts were copied, studied, and preached until even the most outlandish claims felt official. When a priest held such a book in his hands, it was more than paper. It was a key that unlocked the system, justifying trials and punishment as holy work. The machinery was dressed in sacred words, but its product was always the same. Confession extracted, penance imposed, verdict sealed. When we speak of witch hunts, it is easy to picture chaos and frenzy, but the truth is more chilling. It was order that killed. A smooth machinery of sin, turning steadily, powered by belief, built to grind down the accused until nothing remained but ashes and silence. Europe, in the late Middle Ages, was a continent trembling. Crops failed, armies marched, and disease swept through towns like a shadow with no end. The Black Death of the 14th century killed millions. Whole families vanished, and villages were left empty. Even in years without plague, famine stalked the land, and war between kingdoms and empires drained whatever hope remained. In such a world, People wanted answers. Why were they suffering? Who was to blame? And in that search for meaning, fear was given a policy, and anxiety became law. Theology offered explanations when nothing else could. If the earth cracked with hunger, if the skies rained storms, if sickness spread faster than prayers, then surely God was sending a message. But people did not want messages alone. They wanted culprits. They wanted faces to accuse, neighbours to blame, and the church was ready to provide them. Preachers spoke of witches as agents of the devil, ordinary people who had opened the door to chaos by signing pacts with darkness. Suddenly, the suffering of millions could be traced to a handful of guilty souls, and the rage of the crowd found a target. It is hard to overstate the desperation of those times. Imagine losing a child to fever with no cure, or watching grain rot in fields while others claimed demons had cursed the soil. In that desperation, the logic of witchcraft fit neatly into daily life. If God was punishing Europe, witches were the reason. And if witches were the reason, then trials and executions became acts of salvation. To burn a witch was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as protection. The more people panicked, the more they demanded action, and the church's policies gave panic a script to follow. Famine, plague, and war did more than create fear. They created opportunities for control. Each disaster stripped people of certainty, and in that vacuum, sermons and decrees carried enormous weight. When leaders declared witches were poisoning wells or calling storms, the public believed because it explained what no physician or king could solve. And once fear took hold, it did not stay in the streets. It reached courtrooms, it reached bishops, it reached inquisitors who believed that by punishing witches, they were stabilizing an entire society. Fear became not only an emotion, but an institution. This is how anxiety turned into policy. It was not written in bold letters, but it was carried in every papal bull that gave inquisitors authority, in every manual that described how witches cursed crops, in every sermon that told farmers to look suspiciously at their neighbours. Anxiety was absorbed into the bloodstream of law and faith until it became inseparable from both. What began as ordinary suffering became a theatre where witches were cast as villains and the church as protector. In truth, witches were never responsible for storms or plague, but by turning anxiety into policy, the Vatican gained what disasters could never provide on their own: a clear enemy, a visible scapegoat, and a system of fear that bound communities together under its watch. Europe's suffering might have been unavoidable, but the witch hunts that followed were not. They were choices, deliberate choices, made in candlelit rooms where theology shaped fear into law. When the Inquisitor arrived in a town, it was never quiet. People whispered, shutters closed, and rumours spread faster than the sound of church bells. The figure of the Inquisitor carried both fear and authority, for he did not come on his own. He carried with him the mandate of Rome, the seal of the church, and the terrifying promise that truth could be extracted from anyone through proper procedure. To the frightened villagers, his arrival meant that unseen forces were about to be dragged into the open, and to the accused, it meant that their lives now balanced on ink, parchment, and the cold tools of interrogation. The office of the Inquisitor was born from a simple idea that heresy could be identified and removed like a sickness. By the 15th century, witchcraft was folded into that same category, and the Inquisitor became its hunter. He was trained not only in theology, but in law. He carried manuals that told him how to question, how to recognize signs of guilt, and how to record confessions in a way that left no doubt of their truth. One of the most infamous was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a book that spread across Europe like wildfire. It instructed inquisitors, step by step, on how to pursue the accused, how to break their defences, and how to prove the presence of the devil in even the smallest details. The inquisitor did not act like a local judge. He was an outsider, sent with power that rose above town councils and even noble lords. His mandate was spiritual, but it had real consequences in the material world. To resist him was to resist Rome. To question his authority was to risk becoming a suspect yourself. And because of that, communities rarely stood against him. Instead, they obeyed, hoping that compliance would spare them from suspicion. His power rested not only on written law, but on the fear that he could see what others could not. The promise of the Inquisitor was that truth was always extractable. It did not matter if an accused woman denied every charge. It did not matter if her neighbours swore by her innocence. If the Inquisitor applied the right questions, if he followed the manual, then confession would come. And if confession did not come freely, there were procedures to ensure it arrived eventually. What mattered was not whether the accused was guilty in reality. What mattered was that the procedure produced guilt on paper. Once signed and sealed, the document became truth, preserved in the archives to be cited long after the flames died out. The arrival of the Inquisitor symbolized a turning point in the witch hunts. Suspicion alone was no longer enough. The machinery of procedure, mandate, and record gave hunts the appearance of order. Every question, every confession, every sentence was written down to prove that the work was just. But behind that appearance was something far darker. It was not truth that was extracted. It was fear, coerced into words, and sealed with the authority of God. Before the flames of witch hunts consumed Europe, the fire began with ink. The spread of suspicion was not immediate, nor did it erupt in every town at once. It moved slowly, carried by parchment and sealed with wax, flowing from the Vatican outward like ripples across still water. Edicts, papal bulls, and pastoral letters became the quiet messengers of fear, embedding the idea of witches into the minds of priests, bishops, and eventually entire parishes. By the time the first pyres were lit, the groundwork had already been prepared in ink. In the early years, documents from Rome travelled by courier on horseback, sometimes taking weeks or even months to reach distant dioceses. A single bull declaring witchcraft as heresy would arrive in a bishop's chancery, where clerks carefully copied its contents into registers. From there, it was read aloud to priests, who then carried the message into the pulpit. What began as a handful of words written in Latin inside the Vatican soon echoed in sermons across Europe. By the time the villagers heard it, the idea no longer sounded like rumour, it sounded like law. Each letter reinforced a uniform suspicion. Where once beliefs in witches varied from town to town, the official documents gave them a single shape. No longer was witchcraft just a tale of old women muttering charms. It was now described as a pact with the devil, a coordinated conspiracy against Christendom. The ink gave order to fear, turning scattered folklore into a doctrine of evil that could be pursued with courts and punishment. And because these messages came from the highest authority in the church, they carried weight that no farmer or villager could challenge. The style of these documents was deliberate. They did not speak with doubt, they spoke with certainty. A papal bull did not say witches might exist, it said they did. A pastoral letter did not suggest caution, it demanded action. And with each repetition, priests absorbed the language, repeating it to their congregations until suspicion became a part of ordinary life. Families began to look at neighbours with fresh eyes, wondering if misfortune was the result of curses. The words travelled slowly, but their roots were deep. This flow of ink created a network of belief that stretched far beyond local disputes. A failed harvest in Germany, a storm in France, an outbreak of sickness in Italy, all could be linked to the same cause because the same letters had seeded the same fear. By unifying the narrative, the Vatican ensured that witchcraft was no longer a local superstition, but an international threat, one that required vigilance everywhere. Before the fires of execution burned, before the cries of the accused filled the air, the first spark was lit by the steady hand of scribes copying decrees late into the night. The witch hunts were not born in chaos. They were born in order, crafted line by line, in documents that told the world who the enemy was. Ink came before fire, and in many ways it was far more dangerous, for it shaped the minds of millions long before the flames reached them. In the year 1487, a book was published that would change the course of European history. Its title was The Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, and it became the most infamous manual of persecution ever written. Before its arrival, suspicion of witches was scattered, uneven, and often doubted by judges and priests alike. After its arrival, there was no more room for doubt. The Malleus claimed to hold every answer. It told clergy how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, how to force confessions, and ultimately how to condemn them. In the hands of the Church, this single book reshaped training and filled courtrooms with a new certainty. The authors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, were Dominican inquisitors who believed witches were a direct threat to the faith. Their book was not just a guide, it was propaganda disguised as scholarship. It opened with declarations that witches were real, and that denying their existence was itself heresy. From that first page, readers were trapped. To question the book was to risk being accused of siding with the devil. With papal approval stamped on its pages, the Malleus spread like wildfire, copied, reprinted, and translated across Europe. Within decades, it had become the handbook for every eager inquisitor. The structure of the book gave it power. It was written in the style of a legal and theological manual, filled with citations from scripture and canon law. But beneath the scholarly tone was something far more sinister. It described women as naturally prone to sin, claimed midwives were enemies of faith, and outlined gruesome methods of interrogation. The book did not present witchcraft as a possibility. It presented it as an absolute truth that had to be rooted out by any means necessary. Judges who might once have hesitated now had a text that told them hesitation was dangerous. Priests who might have doubted now had a manual that insisted doubt was sin. In courtrooms across Europe, the Malleus became a silent third voice. The accused would be questioned, the inquisitor would demand confession, and the manual would sit open on the table, shaping every step. If a woman denied the charges, the book warned that denial was proof of guilt. If she confessed too quickly, it said the devil was tricking her. Every path led back to the same conclusion: guilt. There was no way out, because the manual had already closed every door. The Malleus Maleficarum turned witch hunting into a system. It gave clergy training material, it gave courts justification, and it gave communities a terrifying sense of legitimacy. What might once have been dismissed as rumour became hard evidence simply because the book said it was so. And behind it all was the Vatican's approval, silent but powerful, ensuring the hammer of witches struck again and again. The Malleus moment was not just a turning point. It was the moment when fear became method, and when a single book lit fires that would burn for centuries. When we imagine the witch hunts, it is easy to think of mobs with torches storming through villages. But the reality was far more organised. Witch hunting required permission, authorization, and documents sealed with authority. No inquisitor or judge could simply decide to burn a witch. They needed license to pursue, and that license came in the form of faculties, commissions, and orders from the church itself. The fires that burned in the countryside were lit not only by fear, but by parchment stamped in Rome. Faculties were written powers granted to inquisitors. A priest or friar could not simply accuse anyone of witchcraft without higher approval. He needed authorization from bishops or papal representatives, papers that allowed him to conduct investigations, summon suspects, and hear confessions. These documents spelled out his reach, sometimes limited to a region, sometimes stretching across whole provinces. With faculties in hand, the inquisitor arrived not as an outsider, but as an official messenger of the church, and his word carried the weight of Rome. Commissions went even further. These were formal assignments issued to groups of inquisitors or clerics, giving them the power to root out witches within specific territories. They worked like temporary licenses, often triggered by local panic or reports of strange events. A bishop might petition Rome for help after storms ruined harvests, or after rumours of devil worship spread. In response, a commission would be sent with full authority to question, to try, and to condemn. Villages that once whispered about witches suddenly found themselves in the grip of legal hunts, all backed by signatures and seals. The practicalities of these hunts reveal how deliberate the system was. In rural areas, inquisitors set up temporary courts in churches or town halls. Villagers were summoned to testify, names were recorded, and entire communities were placed under suspicion. It was not wild chaos, it was a dragnet. Lists of suspects grew as neighbours accused one another, often under pressure to name accomplices. Clerks wrote everything down, building case files that justified more arrests. The process was slow, methodical, and terrifying. What looked like justice on paper was, in truth, fear woven into law. These licenses to pursue also ensured that local rulers cooperated. Without authorization, a judge might hesitate to seize property or execute sentences. With a commission letter in hand, however, everything became official. Accused witches could be imprisoned, tortured, or burned with the assurance that the church sanctioned the act. The paperwork provided cover, a way to transform superstition into policy and murder into obedience. The witch hunts were not simply explosions of hysteria. They were constructed step by step through written orders that gave ordinary men extraordinary power. Every faculty and every commission was a key, unlocking the gates of fear in one village after another. And behind each piece of parchment was the same seal, the same hand of authority that turned local rumours into international hunts. License to pursue was not just permission, it was the spark that allowed suspicion to become fire. When we read the records of witch trials today, something strange stands out. Testimonies from different countries, spoken in different languages, and recorded decades apart, often sound almost identical. The accused described signing contracts with the devil, flying at night, meeting in secret gatherings, and renouncing the faith. The words echo like copies of a script rather than spontaneous confessions. This is not coincidence. It is the result of what can be called confession architecture, a system built to shape answers until they fit a predetermined mold. The architecture began with leading questions. Inquisitors rarely asked open inquiries like, "What happened?" or "Why are you accused?" Instead, they asked, "Do you confess that you served the devil?" or "How long have you been attending the witch's Sabbath?" To deny was to appear defiant. To answer was to step into the trap. Each question carried the assumption of guilt, and the accused, frightened, exhausted, or tortured, often gave the responses that seemed least likely to prolong their suffering. Over time, these responses accumulated into a pattern that repeated across Europe. Scriptive templates guided the process even more. Manuals such as the Malleus Maleficarum offered detailed outlines of what confessions should look like. They instructed inquisitors on what to expect, how to interpret silences, and how to press for specific details. If a woman confessed vaguely, the inquisitor would push her to describe a pact. If she mentioned a dream, it would be turned into proof of flight. The template was so rigid that the accused rarely had space to create their own narrative. Instead, they were nudged into rehearsing the story already written for them. The repetition gave confessions an air of consistency, as though hundreds of witches had truly lived the same hidden lives. But the consistency was artificial. It came not from reality, but from pressure. Torture magnified this effect. Under physical pain, victims often repeated back the words their interrogators fed them, just to make the agony stop. Clerks wrote these words down carefully, and once sealed in ink, they became official truth. Future inquisitors then used these transcripts as proof, circling back to the same template that produced them in the first place. For ordinary villagers reading pamphlets or hearing sermons, the confessions felt undeniable. How could so many people in so many places tell the same story unless it was real? But what they did not see was the architecture behind the words, the questions designed to trap, the manuals designed to guide, and the torture designed to break. The similarity of confessions was not evidence of witches. It was evidence of a system that demanded witches exist and built testimony to prove it. In the end, the architecture of confession served two purposes. It silenced the innocent by forcing them into false admissions, and it strengthened the authority of the church by producing endless proof of a war against the devil. The accused lost their voices, replaced by scripts written in Rome, and history remembers not what they truly said, but what the architecture of confession forced them to say. When we look at the history of witch trials, one detail is often softened in textbooks: the role of torture. Official documents from bishops and inquisitors spoke of moderation and restraint. They insisted torture should only be used when evidence was strong, when witnesses agreed, and when guilt was nearly certain. But behind closed doors, moderation on paper rarely matched what happened in practice. The tools no one lists in sermons or records became the most decisive actors in the courtroom. Torture was not random cruelty. It was rationalized through theology. The church argued that saving a soul was worth temporary pain. If the devil's grip was so strong that a witch denied the truth, then pain was seen as a way to break the devil's hold. The suffering of the body was treated as medicine for the soul. Under this reasoning, every scream could be explained as proof that evil was being driven out. And once a confession was extracted, it was praised as the sinner's return to truth, even if the words had been forced out by unbearable agony. The legal thresholds of torture were carefully described. Judges were told to use it only once, to stop before permanent harm, and to ensure witnesses were present. But these rules were elastic. If the accused refused to confess, the session could be resumed on another day and still counted as the same use. If injuries occurred, they were written off as the devil's resistance. Moderation became a word that excused repetition, and the legal thresholds bent again and again until they lost meaning. The tools themselves were simple but terrifying. The strappado hoisted the accused by the arms until joints dislocated. The rack stretched bodies until ligaments tore. Thumbscrews crushed fingers, while boots tightened around legs with wedges of iron. These instruments were not described in detail in official handbooks, but they were known by every inquisitor. They existed in the shadows of the law, tolerated because they produced results. And results in this system meant confession. The theology behind torture gave it a chilling justification. Clerics taught that the devil hardened witches against admitting their crimes, so extraordinary means were required to free their tongues. In this way, denial itself was treated as proof of guilt. The longer a person resisted, the stronger the evidence that the devil was present within them. By the time the accused confessed, the process was framed not as coercion, but as victory over evil. The tormentor could leave believing he had done holy work. What this reveals is a system where law, faith, and violence merged into one. The moderation written in archives was a mask, hiding the brutal reality that unfolded in cellars and chambers across Europe. The tools no one lists tell the truer story. It was not the devil who forced words from the mouths of the accused. It was iron, rope, and pain. And the silence of the Vatican's records today suggests they knew that once those tools were revealed, no theology could ever justify what had been done. When we ask who filled the dockets of witch trials, the answer is painfully clear. It was not powerful nobles or wealthy merchants. It was women, especially those who lived on the margins of society. Midwives, widows, and poor labourers formed the statistical backbone of accusation, and their stories reveal how fear and social order intertwined. These were the women whose daily work placed them close to life and death, to sickness and healing, to events that seemed mysterious in a world where medicine was scarce and explanations were few. Their roles made them visible, but visibility in an anxious society often meant vulnerability. Midwives stood at the center of this pattern. They brought children into the world, used herbs to ease pain, and sometimes performed practices that blurred the line between medicine and superstition. To many villagers, they were essential, but to clerics, they seemed dangerous. The church wanted to control the beginning of life and the rituals surrounding it, yet midwives operated independently, answering not to priests, but to mothers. This independence made them targets. When infants died, which happened often in an age of high mortality, suspicion turned to the woman who had overseen the birth. In court records, midwives were accused of stealing babies for the devil, of using charms during delivery, or of baptizing children in Satan's name. These accusations reflected less about reality and more about fear of women who held knowledge outside of the church's reach. Widows formed another large group of victims. In a society where a woman's protection was tied to her husband, widowhood meant isolation. Without a man to speak for them, widows became easy scapegoats. They were often poor, living on the edge of survival, and when disputes arose over land, inheritance, or charity, they lacked defenders. Accusing a widow of witchcraft required little risk because her absence from the web of family ties left her exposed. Many of these women were elderly, their appearance marked by age, their presence seen as a burden. In times of crisis, neighbours whispered, and whispers quickly became charges. Poor labourers, especially women who worked in fields or as servants, also filled the lists of the accused. Their lives were hard, their income small, and their reliance on others for survival placed them in constant tension with employers and neighbours. If crops failed or animals sickened, suspicion fell naturally on those at the bottom of the hierarchy. The powerless could not fight back, and once accused, they became convenient sacrifices to calm the fears of a village. The pattern of women, work, and worry shows how the witch hunts functioned not only as religious campaigns, but also as social mechanisms. The people chosen as witches were those easiest to accuse, those least able to defend themselves, and those whose roles made them visible in moments of crisis. The Vatican's decrees gave legitimacy to these accusations, but the daily reality of who was targeted reflected deeper anxieties about gender, poverty, and control. To call someone a witch was often less about their deeds and more about their place in a fragile society. And in that fragile world, the women who worked closest to life's mysteries bore the heaviest weight of fear. In the villages of medieval Europe, healing was not performed in grand hospitals or with polished instruments. It was done in kitchens, gardens, and fields. Women gathered herbs, boiled roots, and whispered prayers over the sick. Their knowledge came from generations of trial and error, passed down through families, refined through practice. To those who received care, these women were healers. But to the church, their independence was suspicious. When illness lifted, it was called a blessing. When illness worsened, it was called heresy. Folk medicine lived in a fragile space, accepted until the parish ledger decided otherwise. Herbs, like sage, rosemary, and valerian, were common tools of healing. A woman might crush garlic to fight infection, or brew chamomile tea to ease sleeplessness. These remedies worked often enough to earn trust, but they were also mysterious. How could a poor villager know more about the body than the priest who held the keys of salvation? The church wanted to guard not only the soul, but also the power to define truth. And so healing that fell outside official blessing was easily recast as forbidden knowledge. The line between healing and heresy was never fixed. A remedy praised one year could be condemned the next. It depended on circumstances, on who benefited, and on who suffered. If a healer cured a child when the priest's prayers failed, suspicion grew. If animals thrived after charms were tied around their necks, whispers began. Once those whispers reached the parish record, the outcome was grim. Written down in ink, the healer's name shifted from trusted neighbour to suspected witch. The very knowledge that had once saved lives was transformed into evidence of serving the devil. What made this transformation so effective was the church's monopoly on literacy. Villagers might believe in charms and herbs, but only the parish could record those acts in official form. And the ledger carried far more weight than memory. When inquisitors reviewed records, they saw not the nuance of folk traditions, but a list of supposed crimes. Boiling roots became casting spells. Whispered prayers became incantations. Healing became heresy, not because it was evil, but because it was written as such by men in authority. This was not only about faith, it was about control. By labelling folk healers as witches, the church pulled power away from women and community traditions and centralised it within clerical hands. Medicine was no longer a matter of trial and error, but of doctrine. Those who sought healing had to go through approved channels or risk accusations of turning to forbidden arts. The fear of being named in a ledger silenced many healers and left entire villages dependent on priests who offered prayers rather than cures. The story of herbs, healing, and heresy shows how fragile truth can be when written by power. A cup of tea for fever or a poultice for wounds might seem harmless, but in the wrong moment, under the wrong eyes, it could mean death. What saved lives in one season could end them in another. Once ink turned healing into a crime, and the archives still hold the ledgers where those transformations were sealed forever. A storm rolls in across a village in 16th century France. The skies crack open with thunder, hail crushes the crops, and within hours the work of an entire season is ruined. The villagers stand in despair, and someone whispers a name. Not the name of God, but the name of a neighbour. Soon the gossip becomes certainty. Someone must have called down the storm. Someone must have angered heaven. By the next week, that neighbour is standing in front of a judge, accused not of misfortune but of witchcraft. This is how ordinary disasters were turned into crimes, how storms, stables, and even spoiled milk became part of a prosecutable cosmology. In a world where science was still centuries away from offering explanations, people looked for meaning in every event. If a horse collapsed in its stable, it was not seen as sickness or accident. It was witchcraft. If milk curdled before it reached the table, it was not bacteria. It was sorcery. These micro-cases filled parish records, transforming daily frustrations into evidence of the devil's hand. No event was too small, no accident too ordinary, to avoid being recast as part of a larger war between good and evil. The role of the church in this process was crucial. Priests preached that the devil was active in the world and that witches were his agents. With every sermon, villagers were encouraged to see calamity as intentional. A storm was no longer just weather, it was a weapon. A spoiled crop was no longer nature, it was sabotage. This way of thinking gave the church enormous influence because it positioned priests and inquisitors as the only ones who could interpret the hidden meaning behind events. Ordinary people might see broken tools or sick animals, but the church explained those signs as evidence of witchcraft. And once explained, the path to prosecution was inevitable. Court records from Germany, France, and Italy are filled with these small accusations. A woman blamed for a neighbour's dead cow, a man accused of cursing fields after a quarrel, a widow charged with causing butter not to churn. The charges sound absurd today, but in their time they carried the weight of life and death. Judges treated spoiled milk as seriously as treason because the theology of the era connected every detail to the devil's war against Christendom. To deny the possibility was to deny the authority of the church, and few dared risk that. These micro-cases also reveal how suspicion spread through communities. One accusation led to another. A storm that destroyed a harvest could turn into a dozen trials, as neighbours accused each other to divert blame. Fear spread like a contagion, infecting even the smallest corners of daily life. No one was safe, because misfortune was everywhere, and misfortune required a culprit. Storms, stables, and spoiled milk may sound like minor troubles, but in the witch hunt era, they became doorways to execution. What began as everyday life turned into prosecutable cosmology, and behind it all stood the same institution, shaping the rules, recording the charges, and sealing the verdicts. The Vatican did not need to invent disasters. It only needed to give them meaning, and once it did, no storm or stable was ever just ordinary again. In the imagination of the Middle Ages, the devil was not only a shadow or a whisper, he was a notary. He was thought to deal in paperwork, contracts, and signatures that bound souls as firmly as any legal deed. Across Europe, the witch hunts built a bizarre paper trail of diabolical agreements, as if the devil ran his own bureaucracy. In trial records, accused men and women were said to have signed their names in blood, left marks in strange books, or received tokens that proved their pact. These confessions were copied and preserved, turning nightmares into notarized evidence. The idea of a devil's contract gave courts a way to make witchcraft concrete. A storm or a sick animal could be dismissed as coincidence, but a signed agreement with Satan was impossible to ignore. Inquisitors asked accused witches to describe when and how they entered into this pact. Did the devil hand you a book? Did he prick your finger for blood? Did you see your name written in his ledger? Under pressure, many repeated these questions back as answers, creating eerie consistency across cases. Soon, every trial seemed to include some version of the devil's contract, whether or not such a thing had ever been imagined by the accused before interrogation began. What is most chilling is how this fantasy was treated with the seriousness of legal procedure. Confessions described contracts, signed under moonlight, witnessed by demons, sealed with a kiss. Scribes recorded these details as if they were notarizing real transactions. Judges debated whether a mark on the skin could serve as the devil's signature. The paper trail grew as clerks filled archives with documents about imaginary contracts, and once written down, those fictions became facts for future trials. The bureaucracy of witchcraft was self-sustaining. Each new record justified the next. The Vatican's role in this bureaucratization was subtle but powerful. By framing witchcraft as heresy, the Church transformed a vague accusation into a crime that required paperwork. Every confession had to be documented. Every contract had to be recorded. What had once been folklore became bound to parchment, stamped with seals, and stored in chanceries. The devil's deal was not simply feared, it was filed. The result was a strange fusion of nightmare and administration, where the diabolical was treated like property law. The image of witches signing away their souls in blood became one of the most enduring myths of the era. It gave the hunts a clear narrative. If the accused had signed, then they were guilty beyond question. And if their names were in Satan's book, then the Church had no choice but to strike them from the book of life. Yet the very consistency of these stories reveals their invention. The contract was less about what witches actually believed, and more about what the courts needed to prove. It was paperwork designed to make fear official. The devil's contract shows us how deeply the witch hunts relied on the machinery of writing. The nightmare became bureaucratic, the spiritual became administrative, and every false signature carved another line in the archives. To this day, the paper trail survives in Vatican vaults, silent proof of how belief in evil was bound not just in fire, but in ink. In theory, the pursuit of witches was about saving souls, but in practice it was also about power. Across Europe, different courts claimed authority over witchcraft, and instead of cooperation, they often clashed. Bishops' courts, inquisitorial courts, and secular benches all wanted jurisdiction, and their turf wars created an atmosphere where accusations multiplied and victims were trapped between rival powers. What should have been a single trial often became a contest, and in that contest, the accused rarely survived. The bishop's court was the oldest player. Bishops claimed authority over matters of heresy and sin within their dioceses. When whispers of witchcraft rose, local priests reported to the bishop, and his court could summon villagers to answer charges. These trials were rooted in canon law, framed as spiritual correction, but they carried real punishments. At times, bishops leaned toward fines or penance, but as fear deepened, they turned more often to prison or execution. The bishop's court viewed itself as the guardian of orthodoxy, unwilling to surrender its influence to outsiders. The inquisitorial courts arrived later, armed with papal bulls and the authority of Rome. Inquisitors considered themselves specialists, experts in rooting out heresy wherever it hid. When they entered a region already under the watch of a bishop, tensions rose. Who had the right to interrogate suspects? Who could seize property? Who would claim credit for cleansing the land of witches? The overlap often meant that suspects were tried more harshly, as neither side wanted to appear lenient. The rivalry turned ordinary accusations into spectacles, where each court pressed harder to prove its vigilance. Then came the secular benches, courts run by princes, dukes, or town councils. For them, witchcraft was not just heresy, it was treason against the state, a crime that threatened the stability of the realm. Secular judges imposed harsher sentences, often favouring execution over penance, and they saw church courts as too slow or too soft. Yet they also depended on clerical authority to define witchcraft in the first place. This uneasy relationship meant that when secular and church courts overlapped, they competed rather than collaborated. Each sought to assert dominance, and the accused were the ones who paid the price. Competition among courts also multiplied victims, because each authority sought to prove its relevance. If a bishop condemned 10 witches, an inquisitor might condemn 20. If a secular judge burned a handful, his rivals might double the number. Each verdict added fuel to the fire, not just literally, but politically. To be strict was to appear loyal to God and protector of the people. To be lenient was to risk looking weak, or worse, sympathetic to heresy. The safest choice for every court was severity, and so severity became the rule. The witch hunts grew not only from fear of the devil, but from fear of losing jurisdiction. Courts in competition did not stop one another. They pushed each other forward, creating a spiral of prosecutions that spread across Europe. Behind every victim stood not just an accuser, but a system where rival powers used human lives to defend their turf. And in that deadly contest, justice disappeared, leaving only ashes. The arrival of the printing press in the 15th century transformed the witch hunts from local events into a continental panic. What had once been whispered in taverns or preached in pulpits could now be stamped onto paper, multiplied by the hundreds, and spread across towns within days. Pamphlets, broadsides, and woodcut illustrations became the new weapons of fear, creating a feedback loop between the pulpit and the street. Villagers who might never witness a witch trial firsthand could still hold a sheet of paper that told them witches were real, dangerous, and everywhere. Pamphlets carried lurid accounts of trials, written in dramatic tones that blurred fact and fiction. They described confessions, sabbaths, and pacts with the devil in detail, often exaggerating to capture readers' attention. These small books were cheap, portable, and easy to share. A single copy could pass through dozens of hands, each reader repeating the stories aloud to neighbours. Suddenly the terror of one village became the terror of many. The printing press did not invent fear of witches, but it amplified it beyond anything the medieval world had known. Broadsides worked like posters. Printed on large sheets, they proclaimed executions, listed the crimes of the condemned, and called on the faithful to beware. Pasted on doors or hung in marketplaces, they turned private accusations into public warnings. People who saw them felt part of a grand battle against evil, even if the supposed witches lived far away. The broadsides acted like sermons in ink, spreading the same messages preached from pulpits, but with the added permanence of the written word. A sermon could be forgotten. A broadside remained nailed to a wall, staring back at the community every day. Woodcuts gave the panic its most powerful imagery. With bold lines and stark contrasts, they showed witches flying through the night, kissing demons, or cursing crops. These pictures burned themselves into the memory of anyone who saw them, especially those who could not read. For the illiterate majority, woodcuts were proof. They did not care whether the scenes were symbolic or exaggerated. The image of a woman riding a broomstick or dancing with the devil was more convincing than any sermon. The pictures made the invisible visible, and once seen, they could not be unseen. The result was a feedback loop. Priests preached against witches, pamphlets recorded the warnings, broadsides spread the news of executions, and woodcuts etched the fear into every household. Each form reinforced the other, creating an atmosphere where doubt was nearly impossible. If the pulpit said witches were real, and the pamphlet told stories of witches, and the woodcut showed witches, then witches had to exist. People lived in a world saturated by repetition, until suspicion felt like certainty. Printing the panic ensured that witch hunts no longer needed to start with local quarrels. They could ignite from paper alone. A story printed in Cologne could spark fear in Paris. A broadside nailed in Nuremberg could shape sermons in Vienna. The press gave witchcraft a new kind of life, one that travelled faster than rumour and lasted longer than memory. And in that printed fear, the Vatican found a powerful ally, for the machinery of panic now ran on ink as much as on fire. The power of the witch hunts was not only in what was spoken from pulpits or shouted in courtrooms, it was also in what was silenced, hidden, or forbidden to be read. The Church did not simply shape belief by spreading ideas, it shaped belief by erasing alternatives. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books, became one of the most powerful tools in this process. First published in the 16th century, it listed works that Catholics were forbidden to own or read under threat of excommunication. To many, it looked like a catalogue. In truth, it was a weapon, a way to narrow the boundaries of thought until only one version of reality remained. Books that questioned the reality of witches, texts that suggested natural explanations for storms or illness, and works that critiqued the authority of the Church often appeared on the index. Some were burned, others censored, and still others hidden away in vaults. The act of banning was not only about protecting faith, it was about controlling the story. If people read that witchcraft was a delusion, or that trials were unjust, the machinery of fear would collapse. By erasing those voices, the Vatican ensured that suspicion of witches remained the only story that could be told. Bowdlerization played a quieter role. Not all books were banned, some were altered, passages were removed, language softened, and editions reprinted to fit doctrine. A medical text might lose its discussion of herbs, leaving only prayers. A history might drop mention of failed hunts, keeping only the victories. Readers believed they were encountering the whole truth, but in reality they were holding a version carefully trimmed to serve the Church's narrative. Silence was not always loud. Sometimes it was hidden between the lines. Researchers today still struggle with this legacy. Vast collections of manuscripts remain locked in the Vatican archives, accessible only under strict conditions. Scholars must request documents one by one, with no guarantee of seeing what they ask for. Photographs are forbidden, copies are restricted, and entire sections remain closed. The reason given is preservation or privacy, but the effect is erasure. Whole chapters of history remain invisible, not because they were lost, but because they are withheld. The witch hunts are among the areas most affected, with trial records, theological debates, and letters of dissent locked away from public view. The combination of bans, censorship, and hidden archives created a world where ordinary people never had the chance to think differently. The faithful were told what they could read. The doubters were silenced before they could publish. the curious were denied access to records that might challenge the story. In this way, erasure became policy, and history itself was edited to match theology. The witch hunts were not only fed by sermons and pamphlets, they were sustained by what was removed from sight. And in the silence of those forbidden shelves lies the truest record of how power writes the past. Walk into the vast halls of the Vatican archives, and you are surrounded by shelves that stretch for miles. Boxes, bundles, and manuscripts fill the space, each promising to preserve the memory of history. Yet the deeper one looks, the more obvious the blind spots become. It is not only what is stored that matters, it is what is missing, sealed, or erased. When it comes to the witch hunts, the silence is not accidental, it is manufactured. The archive tells a story, but it is a story carefully shaped by what was allowed to remain visible. Missing dockets are the first sign. Trial records from towns known to have executed dozens of women suddenly vanish, leaving only a few fragments or summaries. Pages that should contain confessions, verdicts, or names of inquisitors are gone. Sometimes they are torn out. Sometimes entire registers are absent. Scholars know these trials happened because references survive in letters or financial ledgers, but the detailed accounts have disappeared. Without those details, the cruelty fades into vagueness, and the responsibility of those who carried it out remains hidden. Absence becomes its own form of protection. Sealed bundles are another obstacle. In the archive, some manuscripts are tied shut with ribbons or stored in restricted cabinets. They exist, but no one outside the church may read them. The labels often give away just enough to spark questions. A bundle marked Trials of Witches in Lombardy or Confessions of Heresy in Spain might sit untouched for centuries. The Vatican explains these seals as matters of preservation or privacy, yet the effect is denial. Knowledge is not lost, it is locked. The silence that follows is not the silence of forgetting, but of withholding. Even when documents survive, they often show scars of erasure. Marginalia scraped away with knives, names blacked out with ink, passages crossed through until the parchment is nearly destroyed. These edits are not careless damage. They are deliberate choices to remove details that might cast doubt on the official narrative. A clerk's angry note about an inquisitor's cruelty, a witness statement that contradicted the court, a mention of torture used too freely, all could be scraped away until the page looks smooth again. The past was polished to fit the story the church wanted to tell. The archive's blind spots remind us that silence is an active process. It is not only the result of time or decay, but the work of human hands shaping memory. Each missing docket, sealed bundle, or erased margin served a purpose. They reduced accountability, softened brutality, and left future generations with gaps that could never be fully filled. To read the archive is to read not only what is present, but also what is absent. The witch hunts live on in those gaps, hidden in the blank spaces where lives and truths were scraped away. And in those silences we can still hear the faint echo of voices that someone wanted us to forget. The witch hunts are remembered as centuries of fire, but even within the Vatican there were moments when Rome said enough. These were not grand announcements or dramatic reversals. They were cautious letters, quiet reviews, and hesitant acknowledgements that the frenzy had gone too far. Yet these gestures of restraint came late and softly, long after thousands had been condemned. The machinery of panic had already been built, and by the time Rome tried to slow it, the flames were burning across the continent. As early as the 15th century, some churchmen expressed doubt about the scale of witchcraft accusations. A few bishops noted that confessions often sounded too alike, suspiciously scripted, as if more the product of interrogation than genuine memory. Others observed that torture produced unreliable testimony. These voices questioned whether the courts were punishing real heresy or merely feeding a cycle of fear. Yet their words rarely reached the pulpit. Instead, they remained in correspondence or legal reviews tucked away in chancery files. Rome's skepticism existed, but it rarely crossed into the lives of villagers who still saw women burned in marketplaces. By the 17th century, the excesses had grown impossible to ignore. In some regions, entire towns were consumed by accusations, with dozens executed in a single season. Even secular rulers began to worry that the hunts were destabilizing society. Rome responded with cautious restraint. Papal letters reminded inquisitors to proceed carefully, to avoid relying too heavily on torture, and to ensure that accusations had credible evidence. These instructions acknowledged the chaos, but they came like drops of water on a roaring fire. In practice, local courts often ignored them, continuing trials with the same brutality as before. There were also moments when Rome reviewed notorious cases and condemned the methods used. Some inquisitors were reprimanded for overstepping their authority. In rare situations, trials were annulled and sentences overturned. But these corrections were exceptions, not the rule. For every case where Rome intervened, hundreds more went unchecked. The message of restraint was too quiet, drowned out by the sermons of fear and the demands of communities desperate for culprits. What is most striking is how the Vatican balanced skepticism with silence. To admit openly that witch hunts were built on weak foundations would have undermined centuries of teaching. And so Rome spoke in careful tones, never fully denying the reality of witches, but urging moderation. This moderation often arrived too late to save the accused. By the time a review reached a distant town, the pyre had already burned. The words of restraint survived in letters, but the victims did not. When Rome said enough, it revealed that the Church was not blind to the dangers of its own system, but saying enough quietly, without dismantling the machinery that had been created, left fear intact. The Vatican may have whispered caution, but fear screamed louder, and history remembers the screams, not the whispers. Beneath the language of demons and heresy, the witch hunts often hid something far more earthly. Politics under the cassock shaped trials as much as theology did. Local lords, priests, and judges were not only guardians of faith, they were also men with land to gain, debts to settle, and families to protect. Time and again, verdicts in witch trials aligned suspiciously well with property disputes, inheritances, and rivalries. The flames that consumed the accused often cleared a path for someone else's fortune. Widows were frequent targets, not just because of superstition, but because they held land without a male heir. In many parts of Europe, once a widow was convicted, her property was confiscated. Sometimes it went to the local lord, sometimes to the church, sometimes to neighbours who had long eyed her fields. The language of witchcraft cloaked what was in truth a transfer of wealth. A woman condemned at the stake was also a woman whose orchard, house, or livestock suddenly became available. The theology of sin made it seem righteous. The politics of land made it profitable. Inheritance battles also found their way into trial records. Families fighting over property might accuse an inconvenient relative of witchcraft. Brothers denounced sisters. Nephews accused aunts. What should have been argued in courts of law was decided in courts of fear, where the outcome was already weighted toward the accuser. Once the charge of witchcraft entered the case, there was little chance of acquittal. The accused lost not only their lives but their legacies, leaving behind estates that passed to the very people who had pointed the finger. Local lords used trials to assert authority. By supporting accusations, they showed their subjects they were vigilant protectors of order. At the same time, they often benefited materially from the confiscations that followed. Parish priests cooperated, knowing that a successful hunt reinforced their own power from the pulpit. Together, secular and religious leaders wrapped political maneuvering in the cassock of piety. Villagers saw fire and sermon. Behind the curtain, men in power counted the gains. Not every case was born of greed, but the pattern is too consistent to ignore. Records reveal villages where multiple landholders accused were conveniently replaced by rivals. Estates passed to allies of inquisitors. Even debts were erased when creditors were branded witches. The trials created a world where personal quarrels could be settled with theological justification. The devil became the ultimate excuse for taking what one wanted. Politics under the cassock reminds us that the witch hunts were never only about faith or fear. They were also about power, wealth, and control dressed in holy robes. When verdicts lined up neatly, with land grabs or inheritance disputes, the true motive stood exposed, even if cloaked in the language of salvation. The archives may present these trials as battles against heresy, but the shadows between the lines reveal another story. In those shadows, the devil was not always in the accused. Sometimes he was in the courtroom itself. Every witch trial ended with smoke, but behind the smoke was a ledger. The economy of a pyre was as real as the theology that justified it, though far less often preached from the pulpit. Trials cost money. Inquisitors needed travel funds, guards demanded wages, scribes had to be paid for recording testimony. Even the wood that fueled the fire was not free. Every expense appeared in records, carefully itemized, and those expenses had to be recovered. The solution was simple. The accused would pay for their own persecution, whether in coin, land, or property. Death was not the end. It was the final transaction. Fees began the process. To summon an accused witch into court required clerks to draft documents and messengers to deliver them. Each step carried a charge. The accused or their family bore these costs, no matter the verdict. If imprisoned, the prisoner was billed for food, chains, and the guard's time. Some records even note charges for straw bedding, charged to people who would never live to see another day. The very act of being accused was enough to sink entire families into debt. Guilt was not required. The trial itself was a financial sentence. Fines multiplied the burden. Even if an accused witch escaped execution, the court often imposed heavy financial penalties. These fines filled the coffers of local authorities and church officials. They were justified as penance, but in practice they worked as revenue streams. Villages facing poor harvests or rulers short on funds found witch trials convenient. Each condemned soul translated into wealth for the court. Justice became an account, and the fire was its closing balance. Confiscations brought the largest rewards. Once convicted, a witch's property was seized. Houses, fields, tools, livestock, even clothing could be auctioned or absorbed into the holdings of local lords. The church also claimed its share, often taking valuable manuscripts, heirlooms, or jewellery. Families left behind were stripped of wealth, sometimes reduced to beggary. The death of one member could ruin generations. To the public, it was divine punishment. To the accountants, it was redistribution. This hidden economy explains why the hunts lasted so long. They were not only fueled by fear, but by profit. Each accusation set money flowing into multiple pockets. Inquisitors gained prestige and income. Lords expanded their land. Clergy reinforced their authority while quietly enriching their treasuries. Even the executioners received payment for their grim work, charging fees for rope, firewood, and the act of burning itself. The system ensured that every hand in the chain had reason to keep the hunts alive. The economy of a pyre reveals a truth rarely spoken in sermons. Witch hunts were not only about saving souls or defending faith, they were also about balance sheets. Behind the sacred language of sin stood ledgers filled with numbers. The smoke that rose from a pyre carried with it not just the life of a condemned person, but the proof that fear could be turned into profit. And as long as the ledger columns added up, the fires kept burning. A woman touches a sick child and prays, and when the child recovers it is called a miracle. Another woman mixes herbs, whispers a charm, and when the child recovers it is called witchcraft. The difference is not in the outcome, but in who authorizes it. In the world of the witch hunts, miracle and malifice were mirror images, divided not by practice but by power. The same gestures that brought healing or comfort could be exalted as holy or condemned as heretical, depending on whether they flowed through the church or around it. The church claimed ownership of the supernatural. Wonders performed by saints or relics were promoted as signs of divine favour. Pilgrims travelled for days to touch bones, drink water from sacred springs, or hear stories of visions. The faithful were told that God sometimes broke the rules of nature to affirm the truth of his church. These miracles were carefully recorded, investigated, and catalogued. Entire volumes of canonization processes focused on proving that saints had performed verifiable wonders. At the same time, the smallest unsanctioned act outside the church's control was branded as the work of the devil. Healing is the clearest example of this divide. Monks and priests who laid hands on the sick and prayed over them were celebrated. Women who brewed teas or made poultices for the same illnesses were condemned. Both offered hope. Both worked at times, but only one had the backing of the parish. The other challenged the monopoly of sacred authority. To accept that a village healer could cure as effectively as a priest was to admit that God's power was not confined to clerical hands. That admission was dangerous. The simplest way to prevent it was to label one holy and the other heresy. The same contradiction appeared in stories of visions. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen were praised for their revelations, which were filtered through church approval. Yet, if an ordinary woman claimed to see spirits or dream of the future, she risked being branded a witch. The content of the visions mattered less than the channel. If visions affirmed doctrine, they were exalted. If they existed outside the church's narrative, they were suspect. Miracle and malifice lived side by side, separated only by authority. This divide extended even to natural wonders. A sudden storm could be hailed as an act of God, protecting the faithful, or condemned as a witch's curse. The line between blessing and curse was not drawn in the sky, but on the pulpit. The same event could shift meaning with a priest's words, and once defined, the label stuck. The accused rarely had the power to challenge it. Miracle versus malifice exposes the way power shaped reality. The church controlled the interpretation of wonder, branding some events sacred and others profane. This control was less about truth and more about monopoly. To decide what counted as holy was to decide who held authority over hope itself. And in that division, countless lives were destroyed, not because of what they did, but because of who was allowed to name it. In the age of witch hunts, belief was not only taught through sermons or written in edicts. It was performed. Saints, demons, relics, and exorcisms all became part of a stage where fear was not just explained but displayed. Villagers gathered in churches or town squares to witness what they were told was a battle between heaven and hell. The line between religion and theatre blurred, and through that spectacle, fear was refined into policy. What people saw with their own eyes carried more weight than any doctrine on paper. Relics were among the most powerful props in this theatre. Bones of saints, scraps of cloth, drops of blood, or fragments of wood claimed to be from the cross were paraded before the faithful. These objects were said to heal the sick, ward off demons, or prove the presence of holiness. Crowds travelled for miles to see them, kneeling in awe as priests lifted relics high above the altar. The message was clear: sacred power resided in the church alone, and only by trusting its relics could people be protected from invisible dangers. At the same time, the very existence of relics framed the world as a battlefield of spirits, making belief in witches feel not only plausible but inevitable. Exorcisms carried this performance even further. When a person trembled, screamed, or spoke strangely, priests declared it the work of a demon. The ritual of exorcism became public theatre. Candles were lit, prayers thundered, holy water was splashed, and the crowd watched as the supposed demon was driven out. The drama was gripping, terrifying, and unforgettable. For those who saw it, there was no question that evil was real, active, and near. The fear instilled by these displays did not end when the ritual did. It followed people home, where every misfortune could now be seen as demonic. And when misfortune struck, the hunt for witches found fertile ground. Theatrical as they were, relics and exorcisms were not random. They served policy. By controlling the symbols of holiness and the rituals of protection, the Church positioned itself as the only authority able to fight the devil. Fear was cultivated, but so was dependency. Villagers were reminded that they could not protect themselves with charms or herbs. Only the Church had the weapons. Only the Church could define who was holy and who was heretical. And those definitions shaped the trials that followed. Stagecraft also created a feedback loop. The more people witnessed relics working miracles or demons being expelled, the more they demanded action against witches. The more they demanded, the more priests supplied, reinforcing the cycle. What began as theatre hardened into law, with councils issuing edicts and courts writing verdicts rooted in fear first performed in public squares. Saints, demons, and stagecraft turned invisible theology into visible reality. The performance gave the unseen devil a body and a voice, and once seen, he could not be doubted. Fear took shape before the eyes of entire communities, and from that shape came policy that burned into the lives of thousands. The stage was not entertainment, it was a script that led straight to the pyre. Amid the roar of sermons and the crackle of pyres, there were voices that dared to whisper against the tide. Jurists, clerics, and humanists who questioned the witch hunts existed, though their words were faint and often punished. They looked at the machinery of trials, the confessions carved out under torture, the strange consistency of testimonies, and they saw not proof of the devil, but proof of injustice. Yet their doubts were dangerous. To question the process was to question the authority of both church and state. Still, some chose to speak, and their whispers echo faintly through the records that survive. One of the earliest skeptics was a German jurist named Ulrich Molitor, who in the late 15th century wrote that many stories of witches were exaggerations or illusions. He did not deny the existence of evil, but warned against blind faith in every accusation. His words circulated quietly, yet they were overshadowed by the louder and more terrifying pages of the Malleus Maleficarum. Others followed, men like Johann Weyer in the 16th century, a physician who argued that accused witches were not servants of Satan but sick, deluded, or vulnerable people who needed care rather than condemnation. Weyer's writings criticized the cruelty of inquisitors and the absurdity of believing that old women could truly command storms or ruin harvests. His work was groundbreaking, but it earned him ridicule from clerics and dismissal from authorities who saw him as naive or dangerous. Even within the church itself, there were clerics who questioned the methods. Some priests observed that confessions extracted under torture could not be trusted, since victims would say anything to end the pain. Others quietly admitted that many accusations began in gossip or envy rather than evidence. A few brave bishops attempted to restrain trials in their dioceses, urging moderation or even halting executions. But their influence rarely spread beyond their own jurisdictions, and their caution was drowned out by the thunder of fear preached from other pulpits. To speak too loudly risked charges of heresy, and so most who doubted kept their voices to whispers. Humanists of the Renaissance added another layer of skepticism. With their focus on reason, classical learning, and the dignity of man, they found the witch hunts primitive and irrational. Yet, even they spoke carefully. To attack the hunts openly was to invite suspicion. Their critiques were often framed indirectly, hidden in treatises on law, medicine, or philosophy. They asked questions rather than making accusations, but even questions could be dangerous. Many lost positions, reputations, or even their freedom for daring to doubt. These countervoices remind us that not everyone believed the narrative of the witch hunts. There were always people who saw through the smoke, who understood that fear had been weaponized and who tried to resist in the only ways they could. Yet, their resistance was fragile. Whispers cannot stop a mob, and reason cannot always outshout fear. The tragedy of their stories is not only that they were silenced, but that their warnings, if heeded, might have spared thousands. Instead, their words lay hidden, buried in forgotten manuscripts, waiting centuries to be heard again. The geography of the witch hunts was never random. Where one border ended and another began, the fate of the accused could shift dramatically. In some regions, under strong papal influence, the noose tightened and the fires burned higher. In others, where Rome's authority was weaker or challenged, trials slowed or even faded. The map of Europe became a patchwork of fear, where crossing a river or mountain could mean the difference between life and death. Geography mattered because power mattered, and power was not evenly spread. In Italy, so close to the heart of Rome, trials were more carefully controlled. The Vatican, while never free of suspicion, often preferred to centralize authority, keeping inquisitors on a tighter leash. Some regions saw executions, but on a smaller scale compared to the vast hunts that swept across Germany or Switzerland. The presence of papal bureaucracy acted as both a fuel and a brake. Accusations could not simply erupt into chaos without clerical oversight, yet that oversight did not mean mercy. It meant Rome decided when and how fear should be deployed. Cross the Alps into the German states, and the story changed. Fragmented political authority, overlapping jurisdictions, and zealous clergy created the perfect storm. Without a single controlling hand, rival courts competed to prove their vigilance. Here, the papal message of vigilance was amplified by local ambition, leading to mass hunts that claimed hundreds of lives in a single region. Geography mattered because the patchwork of small states allowed panic to spread unchecked. Each town could decide its own level of cruelty, and many chose severity to show loyalty to both God and their rulers. In France, trials varied sharply depending on the closeness of local courts to Paris and to Rome. In areas near the capital, skepticism sometimes prevailed, and appeals to higher courts could overturn executions. But in borderlands, especially near the Holy Roman Empire, accusations were far more brutal. These regions absorbed the panic spilling across borders, as if fear itself was contagious. The Vatican's influence was present, but inconsistent, sometimes restraining, sometimes inflaming, depending on who carried its authority into the villages. England tells another story. With its break from Rome in the 16th century, the witch hunts there took on a different character. The papal shadow was gone, but the suspicion remained. Trials were shaped more by common law and local magistrates than by inquisitorial courts. Executions occurred, yet the numbers never reached the staggering scale of continental Europe. Geography here mattered because separation from Rome meant separation from the machinery of inquisitorial fear, even if belief in witches endured. Borders of blame remind us that witch hunts were not universal storms sweeping all equally. They were shaped by lines on a map, by the reach of papal power, and by the politics of local rulers. The Vatican's influence was strongest in some places, weaker in others, and where it mixed with ambition and rivalry, the result was deadly. Geography turned fear into policy, and the fate of thousands was written not only in trial records but in the borders they could not escape. A witch trial was never only about guilt or innocence. It was a performance. The court became a stage where the accused were forced into roles scripted to instill fear and obedience. The choreography of shame was as carefully arranged as any liturgy. Villagers gathered not just to hear verdicts, but to watch processions, see humiliations, and witness repentance displayed like theatre. Every step of the ritual was designed to reinforce the message that sin was visible, that disobedience had consequences, and that only the church could restore order. Processions were among the most striking features. Accused witches were marched through town squares, often barefoot, sometimes in chains, sometimes carrying heavy candles or crosses. They were made to wear hair shirts, coarse garments that scratched the skin and symbolized both humiliation and penance. The crowd watched as their neighbors were paraded like cautionary tales, bodies turned into living sermons. It was not enough to punish in private. The punishment had to be seen, so that every villager remembered the power of the court and the danger of straying beyond its authority. Confessions were likewise turned into spectacle. The accused were sometimes forced to read their own statements aloud, repeating in trembling voices the supposed crimes of consorting with the devil, poisoning cattle, or cursing children. When they refused, scribes read for them, but the effect was the same. Their words, whether coerced or invented, echoed in the air before the gathered faithful, imprinting the story of guilt into collective memory. Villagers did not leave with evidence. They left with theatre, and theatre was often more persuasive than fact. Even repentance was choreographed. Those who begged forgiveness were made to kneel in front of altars, to kiss relics, or to throw themselves prostrate on the ground. They might be ordered to fast, to walk in circles around a church, or to submit to ritual lashes. These acts were public displays meant to convince onlookers that the church alone had the power to cleanse sin. For the accused, repentance rarely saved them from the stake, but it served the greater narrative. The community saw not just punishment, but restoration of authority, even if the condemned never lived to enjoy it. Executions completed the spectacle. Fires were built in town squares, and crowds assembled as if attending a festival. Bells tolled, prayers were chanted, and officials presided with solemn ceremony. The burning was not presented as murder, but as theatre of purification. Smoke rising into the sky was described as the soul's final offering, proof that the court had fulfilled its sacred duty. For the crowd, it was a lesson written in flame, one that lingered long after the ashes were gone. Trial as spectacle reveals that witch hunts were not only legal proceedings, they were rituals of control. The choreography of shame turned fear into memory, embedding obedience into the very rhythm of daily life. Villagers left believing they had witnessed justice, but in truth they had witnessed theatre. And in that theatre, the script always ended the same way, with the accused consumed by fire and the audience convinced of its necessity. Children became some of the most unsettling actors in the witch hunts, not because they were accused, but because they were believed. Dreams, visions, and nightmares from young voices were transformed into evidence, and once spoken, they were nearly impossible to challenge. A child who claimed to see an old woman flying through the night or whispering with demons could doom that woman to the pyre. The vulnerability of children, their tendency to imagine, fear, or repeat what adults suggested, was twisted into a weapon. The ethics of trusting such fragile testimony broke before they were ever written. In many trials, children were summoned as witnesses. Judges asked leading questions. Did you see your neighbour curse the cow? Did you hear her call upon the devil? A frightened child, eager to please, or too young to understand the weight of the moment, might nod or invent details. Those details, once written down, became truth in the eyes of the court. The inconsistency of childhood memory was ignored. The innocence of a young voice was taken as purity, as if children were incapable of deceit. In reality, their words were shaped by fear, suggestion, and the overwhelming pressure of authority. Dreams became another dangerous tool. A child who woke screaming in the night might whisper that witches had come to their bed. Parents carried these fears to priests, who treated them as visions. Courts recorded such dreams as proof of demonic presence, even though they reflected nothing more than the natural terrors of childhood. Nightmares, once the realm of comfort and reassurance, were transformed into accusations that could end lives. An imagined devil in the dark became a neighbour condemned by daylight. The most tragic cases involved children pressed into accusing their own family members. Mothers, aunts, or grandmothers were named by trembling voices, often after relentless questioning. The pain of these confessions lingers in the records. A child, caught between love and fear, speaking words they barely understood, while adults around them nodded gravely and inked the statements into official documents. Those words could not be taken back. Once written, they carried the weight of law, even when they came from mouths too young to grasp their meaning. The use of children's testimony exposes the desperation of the hunts. Courts bent every rule of fairness, leaning on those least capable of truth because they were easiest to mould. Vulnerable testimony was not a failure of justice by accident. It was a deliberate choice to privilege fear over reason. Children became pawns in a theatre of accusation, their voices magnified when they should have been protected. Looking back, it is clear that the witch hunts reveal a system willing to sacrifice not only the accused, but the innocence of the young. Children's dreams were weaponized, their fears turned into evidence, their loyalty fractured by pressure from authority. In this way, the hunts destroyed more than lives. They destroyed trust itself, leaving generations haunted by the knowledge that even the words of a child could feed the flames of the pyre. The world of the witch hunts was built on demonology, a framework where illness, storms, and misfortune were all traced back to Satan's hand. But as the centuries moved forward, new voices began knocking on the walls of that world. Medicine, astronomy, and law slowly pressed against the boundaries, challenging the idea that every unexplained event was the work of witches. At first, these voices were cautious whispers, but with time they grew stronger, offering explanations grounded not in demons, but in natural causes. Each knock was a warning that the house of fear could not stand forever. Medicine was among the first challengers. Physicians who studied the human body began to see patterns in disease that had nothing to do with curses. Fevers followed predictable courses, wounds healed or festered based on treatment, and epidemics spread according to contact rather than spells. Some doctors argued that accused witches were not spreading plague but falling ill themselves. Others claimed that strange fits or seizures were not proof of possession, but symptoms of conditions the church had no language for. These explanations often met resistance, yet they planted seeds of doubt. If sickness could be explained by natural causes, then one of demonology's strongest pillars began to crack. Astronomy pressed from another direction. Scholars studying the heavens realized that eclipses, comets, and unusual celestial alignments followed laws of motion rather than the whims of witches. The more precise their calculations became, the less convincing it was to claim that an old woman in a village had drawn down storms or darkened the sky. The stars spoke of order, not chaos, and this order suggested a universe governed by discoverable rules rather than constant demonic interference. To study the heavens was to weaken the fear that every unexplained shadow came from witchcraft. Law also began to shift. As more trials accumulated, some jurists grew uneasy with the reliance on torture and forced confession. They noticed that testimonies repeated the same phrases, as if copied from manuals rather than emerging from truth. Legal scholars began to argue for stricter evidence, for rules that required proof beyond rumour and imagination. In some regions, higher courts overturned local convictions, setting precedents that slowly limited the frenzy. Law was not always merciful, but it became one of the first systems to recognise that fear alone could not serve as justice. The clash between demonology and emerging science was not swift. It was slow, uneven, and often dangerous. Doctors risked accusations for questioning supernatural explanations. Astronomers like Galileo were silenced when their discoveries threatened theology. Jurists who resisted torture were branded as weak or sympathetic to heresy. Yet each act of resistance chipped away at the walls. By the 17th century, the combined pressure of medicine, astronomy, and law made it harder for courts to sustain the old framework. When science knocked, the walls of fear trembled. They did not collapse all at once, but cracks spread wider with each generation. And through those cracks, a new way of seeing the world began to emerge, one where witches lost their grip on explanation and human reason took their place. The retreat from witch hunts did not arrive with a thunderclap. It came in slow motion, whispered through edicts, and formalized skepticism only after the ashes of countless pyres had cooled. By the 17th century, the excesses had become difficult to ignore. Entire villages had been consumed by accusations, families destroyed, economies destabilized. Even within the church and state, there grew an uneasy recognition that the frenzy could not last forever. Yet retraction was cautious, hesitant, and far too late for the thousands who had already perished. Edicts began to temper zeal. Some councils ordered that accusations could no longer rest solely on rumour. Others restricted the use of torture, reminding inquisitors that confessions gained through pain were unreliable. These pronouncements sounded like reform, but they did not erase past horrors. They merely placed guardrails around a system that had already run wild. The problem was never just torture or rumour. It was the very assumption that witches existed in droves, hiding in every village. As long as that belief remained, the trials continued, though at a slower pace. Skepticism began to formalize in legal discourse. Jurists argued that natural explanations were more likely than supernatural ones. Doctors testified that illness could not be proof of malifice. Astronomers showed that eclipses and storms followed natural laws. These voices, once whispers on the margins, were now written into official reports. Some courts began dismissing cases outright, citing lack of evidence. Others required multiple witnesses or physical proof, standards nearly impossible to meet in accusations built on dreams and fear. Slowly, the machinery of the hunt ground down, not because of sudden enlightenment, but because the rules of procedure grew too heavy for hysteria to carry. The Vatican itself pulled back with caution. Where once bulls and letters had fueled suspicion, later ones urged restraint. Popes instructed inquisitors to act with moderation, to avoid zeal that might harm the reputation of the Church. But these words came long after the image of Rome, as the architect of the hunts had been cemented. Moderation sounded hollow when the ground of Europe was littered with unmarked graves. Still, the shift was real. Rome no longer wished to be associated with chaos. Fear had served its purpose, but order had to be restored. The tragedy lies in the timing. Retraction came after centuries of silence, after policies of suspicion had already become habits in villages, after generations had been taught that witches were real and everywhere. By the time skepticism reached the pulpit, belief was woven deep into the fabric of everyday life. Communities had internalized fear long after courts began to abandon it. The ash had settled, but the memory of fire remained. Retraction in slow motion shows how power often works. It does not loudly confess error. It quietly shifts tone, rewrites the rules, and allows memory to fade. The witch hunts did not end with a declaration of guilt or apology. They ended with silence, with the slow turning of pages in law books, and with the hope that no one would ask why the fire had burned so long in the first place. Even as skepticism spread and edicts urged moderation, the fires did not vanish overnight. They smouldered on the edges of reform, lingering in villages and borderlands where old fears outlived new ideas. The last witch trials were not the roaring bonfires of the 16th century, but smaller flames, fueled by inertia and tradition. They burned not because Rome demanded it, but because communities could not easily abandon the habits of fear that had shaped them for generations. The last fires remind us that ideas die slower than decrees. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, executions continued well into the 18th century. Even as higher courts dismissed cases, local judges pressed forward, convinced that witches still walked among them. A crop failure, a sudden death, or a child's illness could still ignite suspicion. Reform in theory meant little when hunger and grief gnawed at a village. The simplest answer was often the oldest one. Find the witch, burn the witch, and hoped the storm would pass. France too saw its final sparks. In the early 1700s, isolated trials condemned women accused of simple acts like muttering curses or preparing herbs. By then, Parisian scholars scoffed at such charges, but in rural provinces, the distance between city reform and village belief was immense. It was not theology, but culture that kept the fire alive. For those who had grown up with sermons about the devil's snares, abandoning the idea of witches felt like abandoning reality itself. Even in Scotland, which had seen some of the fiercest hunts, the last cases dragged into the 18th century. A handful of women were tried and executed, despite growing doubt among elites. In England, where skepticism was stronger, the last execution occurred in the late 1600s, but accusations never entirely ceased. They lingered in whispers, in rumours passed from hearth to hearth, even when courts refused to act. The fires went out slowly, sometimes smouldering for decades, before finally fading into ash. The Vatican's silence during these final chapters is striking. By then, it had retreated from the front lines, allowing local authorities to carry the burden. The Church no longer issued fiery decrees demanding vigilance. Instead, it looked the other way, permitting inertia to do what zeal once commanded. Reform was official, but its echo had not yet reached the farthest villages. In those margins, the old machinery clattered on, grinding down a few more lives before rust finally overtook it. The last fires remind us of the stubbornness of fear. Edicts and skepticism can be written in books, but memory lives in people, and people cling to what they know. A ritual that had ruled communities for centuries could not be undone with a single letter from Rome, or a legal reform in a distant capital. The pyres kept burning, fewer each year, until finally they flickered out, not because truth had triumphed, but because exhaustion, doubt, and new ways of thinking left no fuel for the flames. The witch hunts tried to erase not only people but ways of knowing. Yet fire cannot consume everything. Beneath the ashes, practices survived, disguised, renamed, or carried underground, until the world was safer. What survived the flames was not only memory but continuity. Traditions reshaped to avoid suspicion while keeping their essence alive. In hidden gardens, whispered charms, and rebranded remedies, fragments of the forbidden endured, waiting for a time when they could re-emerge in daylight. Folk medicine was one of the most resilient survivors. Midwives and healers may have been accused in droves, but their knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and remedies did not vanish. Families passed recipes quietly, teaching daughters and nieces under the guise of household wisdom rather than open practice. A poultice for wounds might be explained as common sense rather than sorcery. A tea for fevers became a grandmother's trick rather than a spell. By shedding the language of magic, healing knowledge slipped through the cracks of persecution and lived on in kitchens instead of apothecaries. Charms and protective rituals also endured, though disguised. A whispered prayer over bread, a ribbon tied to ward off sickness, or a carved symbol on a door could all be framed as pious acts rather than remnants of older traditions. The Church itself unknowingly sheltered some of these practices by allowing saints' medals, holy water, and relics to become substitutes for older talismans. What was once pagan became Christianized, absorbed into the rituals of daily faith. The surface changed, but the purpose, seeking protection in a dangerous world, remained the same. Stories carried another kind of survival. Folktales of witches, spirits, and healers continued to circulate, though told with care. They were framed as warnings, entertainment, or children's lessons, but within them lingered coded memories of older beliefs. Tales of wise women in the woods, or of men who spoke with animals, preserved fragments of imagination that no trial could erase. Oral tradition kept alive what written records tried to suppress, ensuring that ideas could slip from one generation to the next, even when libraries remained silent. Even in the realm of science, fragments survived. Some of the knowledge, once branded heretical, was preserved in coded manuscripts, disguised under theological language. A text on healing might be couched in references to saints. An astronomical chart might appear as a religious calendar. Scholars learned to cloak curiosity in piety, embedding discovery within acceptable forms until safer times allowed it to re-emerge more openly. In this way, the flames slowed knowledge but did not extinguish it. What survived the flames shows us that suppression is never complete. Fear can silence voices, but memory finds ways to endure. The witch hunts burned bodies and sought to erase traditions, but underground, disguised, or reborn with new names, the forbidden persisted. The fire consumed much, yet not enough to break the human instinct to heal, to protect, and to remember. Out of the smoke, knowledge survived, waiting to be rediscovered. Deep within the Vatican's archives, there are shelves that remain sealed. Bundles of parchment tied with ribbon, boxes labelled but inaccessible to most eyes. The official story is that these restrictions are for preservation, for order, for the careful management of fragile history, but scholars suspect that behind those locked doors lie documents that would complicate the story of the witch hunts. Not sensational grimoires or spells, but something quieter and more devastating. Proof of mistakes, proof of mercy denied, proof that the system knew more than it admitted. To read the sealed shelf would be to confront the human cost hidden beneath centuries of silence. One category scholars suspect lies hidden are procedural errors. Trials were supposed to follow careful steps, with written indictments, witness testimony, and confirmation of evidence. Yet, in many surviving records, the process is rushed, contradictory, or missing entirely. How many more cases were conducted in ways that broke even the lenient rules of inquisitorial law? These flaws, if exposed, would reveal that the machinery of justice was often an illusion, a mask for chaos. A sealed shelf, filled with such dockets, would confirm what skeptics already fear: that legality was theatre, and countless executions had no firm basis at all. Another likely category is exculpatory letters, appeals, and defences. Families sometimes wrote desperate petitions to bishops or Rome itself, begging for mercy, offering testimony of good character, or pointing out contradictions in the accusations. Few of these survive in open collections, but hints suggest they once existed in larger numbers. Where did they go? If stored away in sealed bundles, they represent voices that were heard but ignored. The presence of such letters would shift the story, proving that doubt existed not only centuries later, but in the very moment of accusation. There may also be lost appeals, cases where verdicts were questioned, delayed, or even overturned quietly without public record. Publicly, the narrative was consistent. Witches were condemned by righteous process. But privately, some inquisitors or higher clerics may have recognized error. If such documents exist, they reveal not only the cracks in the system, but also the effort to conceal them. To admit doubt openly would weaken the entire edifice. To file it away under seal allowed the story of certainty to continue unbroken. What makes the sealed shelf so haunting is that its silence speaks louder than its contents ever could. Scholars suspect, but they cannot prove. The archive itself is designed to maintain that uncertainty. Restrictions create not only absence but doubt, a fog in which speculation thrives. The Church can deny or dismiss without ever needing to confront the actual pages. And as long as the bundles remain tied, history cannot be fully verified. Reading the sealed shelf is less about discovering sorcery than about confronting silence. The documents likely waiting there are not spells, but mistakes, not demons, but humans begging for justice. If revealed, they would change the story from one of uniform certainty to one of contested voices, ignored doubts, and hidden errors. And that shift would be enough to unsettle the very foundation of the narrative the Vatican has so carefully preserved. The memory of the witch hunts did not end when the last trial was recorded, awe when the last pyre went cold. It lived on in the way people were taught to remember them. Textbooks, sermons, films, and children's stories all helped shape a narrative that calcified over centuries. Witches became monsters, hunters became necessary. The messy reality of fear, politics, and theology was sanded smooth into a tale of good versus evil, a story easy to teach and easy to believe. Once repeated often enough, that story became more powerful than the truth itself. In classrooms, the witch hunts were rarely taught as the failures of justice they truly were. Textbooks simplified the era into cautionary tales. Sometimes they emphasized superstition and ignorance, presenting witches as the irrational fears of backward people. Sometimes they portrayed inquisitors as misguided, but ultimately defending society. Rarely did they highlight the role of power, the manipulation of fear, or the silenced voices of the accused. Generations grew up with the impression that the hunts were unfortunate but necessary, a stage humanity had to pass through on its way to modern reason. The pain of victims was reduced to footnotes, while the machinery of accusation was presented as almost logical. Cinema added its own layer. Films from the 20th century onward often portrayed witches as grotesque figures, old women cackling in forests, or demons in disguise. Hunters, priests, or villagers, armed with torches, became the heroes who saved the community. Even when films tried to be sympathetic, they leaned on spectacle, broomsticks, curses, black cats, and flames. The complexity of real lives was replaced by archetypes. On the screen, witches were less about history and more about entertainment, reinforcing the idea that the accused truly had something dark to hide. Audiences left the theatre not with questions about power and injustice, but with vivid images of monsters who deserved their fate. The catechism, the religious instruction taught to millions of children, also hardened memory. Lessons warned against superstition, magic, and rebellion against authority. Though the witch hunts themselves might not be mentioned directly, the framing was clear. Disobedience led to danger. Magic led to sin. The church was the safeguard. These teachings ensured that even after trials ceased, the mindset that sustained them remained. People were taught not to view the hunts as errors of power, but as reminders of the dangers of straying beyond the approved path. The combination of textbooks, cinema, and catechism created a narrative that left little room for doubt. Witches were villains, hunters were guardians. The victim's humanity disappeared beneath layers of fear and storytelling. Memory was molded into a weapon of its own, not to protect against witches, but to protect the institutions that once fueled the fire. To this day, many imagine witches as figures of horror, rather than neighbours dragged into court by rumour and envy. The true history lies buried under the stories we chose to keep, stories easier to repeat than to question, and in that silence, the narrative calcified, as rigid and enduring as stone. The story of the witch hunts does not truly end with the last pyre. It ends, or rather fails to end, in the silence of locked rooms and sealed shelves. For centuries, archives have remained closed, bundles tied, and dockets hidden, the voices of the accused trapped behind stone walls. True repentance cannot be built on silence. It requires transparency. To open the doors is not only to release documents, but to allow history itself to breathe. Without that, the wounds of the past remain unhealed, festering in the shadows of secrecy. The Vatican holds one of the largest collections of historical records in the world. Within those vaults, scholars believe, are trial transcripts, petitions for mercy, letters of doubt, and perhaps even instructions that reveal the machinery of the hunts more clearly than anything yet seen. These are not curiosities, they are keys. Keys that could unlock the truth of how fear was turned into law, how lives were taken, and how silence became policy. As long as those keys remain hidden, the Church carries the weight of unfinished confession. Repentance is not only a matter of prayer or ritual, It is a matter of facing what has been done. When an institution claims moral authority, yet withholds the full story of its role in centuries of persecution, it leaves behind a hollow gesture. Apologies without documents are words without evidence. They cannot restore trust. They cannot honour the dead. Only by revealing everything, by allowing the full story to be told, can history begin to heal. Opening the doors would not destroy faith. It would strengthen it. People do not turn away from institutions because they admit their errors. They turn away when silence becomes unbearable, when secrecy feeds suspicion, and when the past is treated as too dangerous to confront. If the Church truly believes in light, then it should not fear the light of history. Every sealed bundle opened, every hidden letter revealed, would show not only the cruelty of the Hunts, but the resilience of those who endured them. Their humanity deserves to be remembered fully, not partially. The call to open the doors is more than a demand for access. It is a call for honesty, a reminder that history belongs not to those who keep it locked away, but to the world that lived it, and to the generations that inherited its scars. The fires may have gone out centuries ago, but the smoke lingers in memory. To clear that smoke, the truth must be allowed to rise, no matter how unsettling. Only then can the silence finally break. Only then can repentance be real. And only then can the world step forward, knowing that the chains on memory have been lifted and the doors of history have been thrown wide open.